You're all selfish bastards. I am family. I deserve to be in those pictures and at this dinner just as much as anyone else. Sandy's face was inches from the webcam, her features distorted by a rage that felt almost clinical in its intensity. Then, a second voice boomed from behind her, a man I'd never seen but knew exactly who he was. "Don't you talk to my wife like that," he roared. My grandmother didn't flinch. She simply leaned into her microphone and whispered, "This is exactly why no one likes you, Sandy, and it's why you're officially uninvited from everything." Imagine a woman who isn't even part of your family stalking your 70-year-old, 4'9" grandmother at her own bank. Imagine that same woman, who is still living with her legal husband, demanding to be treated like a daughter-in-law while screaming at you through a Zoom screen on Thanksgiving. This isn't just a story about an entitled mistress. It's a study in how a narcissist's double life finally imploded in front of an entire family. We didn't need to raise our voices. We let her own husband do the talking for us. If you found out your uncle's girlfriend was stalking your elderly grandmother, would you try to play nice, or would you burn the bridge and salt the earth? If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Type 1A if you would have stayed quiet to keep the peace for your uncle, or type 2B if you would have exposed her double life right then and there. Leave a comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what happens in Chapter 7 is where the legal reality sets in. I remember the exact weight of the digital camera in my hands. It felt solid, cold, and dependable, unlike the woman standing across from me. We were at my grandmother's house for what should have been a routine family portrait session. My grandmother is a tiny woman, barely 4'9" and well into her 70s, but she carries herself with a quiet dignity that usually commands the room. That afternoon, however, the air was thick with a different kind of energy. Sandy had been dating my uncle for exactly 32 days. In my world, 32 days is a trial period for a streaming service, not a lifetime membership into a family legacy. Yet, there she was, standing next to him with a proprietary grip on his arm. Sandy was a tall woman with sharp features and eyes that never seemed to settle. What made the situation truly clinical was the fact that Sandy wasn't just my uncle's new girlfriend. She was still legally married, living in a house 30 miles away with a husband who, presumably, had no idea she was currently auditioning for a new family. "All right, everyone," I said, my voice flat and professional. "I want one shot with just Grandma and her biological children and grandchildren. Everyone else, please step out of the frame for a moment." I watched through the lens as my cousins moved to the side. The room went quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. I waited for Sandy to move. She didn't. Instead, she tightened her grip on my uncle's blazer. I lowered the camera and looked at her directly. My pulse was steady, 68 beats per minute. "Sandy," I said softly, "just this one shot. We'll do the group photos next." The transition was instantaneous. Sandy's face didn't just turn red, it contorted. The muscles in her neck corded and her breathing became audible, sharp, ragged inhalations that broke the silence of the living room. "I am family!" she screamed. The volume was so sudden that my grandmother flinched, her small hand reaching for the arm of her chair. "I am dating your uncle, which means I deserve to be in these pictures just as much as anyone else. You're all just trying to exclude me because you're jealous." I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply observed the way her saliva flecked the air and how my uncle looked at the floor, his silence confirming everything I needed to know about the power dynamic in their month-old relationship. "Sandy, you've been here for 4 weeks, I replied, my tone remaining level. "This is a portrait of a 70-year lineage. It's a matter of record, not a matter of feelings." She didn't listen. She launched into a monologue about disrespect and selfish bastards, her voice rising to a pitch that made the glass in the china cabinet vibrate. It was my first glimpse into the clinical narcissism that would eventually lead her to follow my grandmother into the aisles of a pharmacy and the lobby of a bank. At that moment, standing in the middle of a quiet living room, I realized that Sandy didn't want a photo. She wanted a claim. And as I watched her husband's name flash on her phone screen while she clung to my uncle, I knew this was only the beginning of the documentation. After the photo incident, the house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that brings peace. It was the kind that precedes a massive storm. Sandy had eventually stormed out, dragging my uncle behind her like a prized trophy she was afraid to lose. I sat at my desk that evening, the blue light from my laptop screen reflecting off my glasses. I didn't cry. I didn't vent to my cousins. Instead, I opened a blank spreadsheet and began to organize the facts. Fact number 1, Sandy was 45 years old. Fact number 2, she had been dating my uncle for exactly 35 days. Fact number 3, according to public records and a very poorly secured social media profile, Sandy was still very much married to a man named Mark. In the world of calm drama, information is the only currency that matters. While Sandy was busy screaming about her rights as a family member, I was busy documenting her reality. She lived in a suburban house approximately 35 minutes away from my grandmother's quiet neighborhood, a house she shared with Mark. There were photos of them at a backyard barbecue from just 3 months ago, smiling, holding drinks, looking like the picture of marital stability. My uncle, a man who had always been a bit too soft-hearted for his own good, seemed to be living in a state of terminal denial. He told us they were soulmates. He told us she was going through a difficult separation. But as I scrolled through the metadata of her recent posts, the timeline didn't add up. There was no separation. There was only a woman living a double life, fueled by a narcissistic need to be the center of 2 different universes simultaneously. I remember the sound of my own breathing, slow, rhythmic, deliberate, as I looked at a photo of her husband. He looked like a tired man, someone who had spent years navigating the minefield of Sandy's temper. I wondered if he knew his wife was currently demanding to be featured in another family's heirloom portraits. I wondered if he knew she was calling my grandmother Mom while still eating dinner at his table every night. A week later, my uncle came over alone. The house was quiet. I was in the kitchen, the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of a spoon against my teacup, the only sound in the room. He sat across from me, looking haggard. The skin under his eyes was gray. "She's just passionate," he whispered, as if the walls themselves would report back to her. "She just wants to feel included. Is that so wrong?" I set my spoon down. The sound was sharp, like a small gavel hitting a block. "Passion is one thing, Uncle. Fraud is another. She lives with another man. She shares a bank account with another man. And yet she's screaming at Grandma because she wasn't included in a photo of a lineage she doesn't belong to. Do you see the mathematical impossibility of that situation?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked at his hands, which were shaking slightly. My hands, by contrast, were perfectly still. I had already begun to notice the patterns. Sandy wasn't just showing up to family events anymore. She was starting to show up where she wasn't invited, in places that had nothing to do with my uncle. She had begun to ask questions about my grandmother's daily routine. What time did she go to the grocery store? Which pharmacy did she use for her heart medication? Which bank held the family's trust accounts? My uncle thought it was sweet that she wanted to be involved. I saw it for what it was, a predator marking the boundaries of her new territory. I watched him leave that night, his tail between his legs. I went back to my laptop. I added a new tab to my spreadsheet labeled Incidents. I didn't know then that the list would soon include stalking and public harassment. I only knew that Sandy was a variable that needed to be solved. The clock on the wall ticked, 60 seconds for every minute, 3,600 seconds for every hour. Sandy was moving fast, but I was moving carefully. I checked the distance again on the map, 35 minutes. That was the distance between her lie and our reality. And I was going to make sure that when those 2 worlds finally collided, my grandmother wouldn't be the one standing in the wreckage. I closed the laptop. The click of the lid was final. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just needed to wait for the data to finish loading. Probability is a beautiful, heartless thing. It doesn't care about coincidences or good intentions. It only cares about the math. and the math surrounding Sandy's sudden appearance in my grandmother's life was starting to look like a statistical impossibility. It was a Tuesday in early March. The world was just beginning to feel the weight of the pandemic, and my grandmother, all 4'9" of her, was determined to maintain her independence. She insisted on doing her own grocery shopping at the local Costco. It was a 10-minute drive from her house. By contrast, it was a 45-minute drive from the house Sandy shared with her husband, Mark. More importantly, there was another Costco exactly 15 minutes away from Sandy's front door. To visit our local warehouse, Sandy had to drive past her own, bypass 3 major exits, and commit to an extra 30 minutes of travel time. Yet there she was, standing in the dairy aisle next to my grandmother. "Oh my goodness, what a small world," Sandy had chirped, her voice slicing through the low hum of the industrial refrigerators. My grandmother told me about it later that evening over tea. She wasn't frightened yet, just confused. She said she was thinking about getting a membership there because she didn't like her local one, Grandma said, her small fingers tracing the rim of her porcelain cup. But she didn't even have a cart. She was just standing there near the eggs. I didn't interrupt. I listened to the sound of the clock on the wall, tick, 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 and mentally mapped out the layout of that Costco. The dairy section is at the very back of the warehouse. To casually run into someone there, you don't just walk in, you hunt. You navigate through the electronics, the clothing, and the bulk pantry items until you find your target. "Did she buy anything, Grandma?" I asked. My voice was a flat line. "No," Grandma replied, tilting her head. She followed me to the checkout line, talking the whole time about how we were practically family now, but when it was time to pay, she realized she forgot her wallet in the car. She just waved and walked out the exit. I felt a cold, familiar sensation in my chest. Not anger, but a sharpening of focus. I opened my laptop and pulled up the spreadsheet. I created a new column: location, distance from Sandy's home, discrepancy, target, local Costco. Sandy's distance, 35.4 miles. Logical alternative, 8.2 miles. Items purchased, 0. Interaction. Type, unsolicited proximity. I looked at the data. If this were a court of law, a single incident would be dismissed as a fluke. But I knew Sandy. I knew the way her eyes darted around the room during the photo incident, looking for the next person to dominate. She wasn't just shopping, she was scouting. She was testing my grandmother's boundaries, seeing how much space she could occupy in the life of a woman who barely knew her name 6 weeks ago. The next morning, I called my uncle. I kept my breathing steady and my tone clinical. "Uncle, Sandy was at Grandma's Costco yesterday. She drove 35 minutes out of her way to stand in the egg aisle without a wallet. Does that seem efficient to you?" There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the sound of him shuffling papers. "She just wants to be helpful, Nina," he stammered. "She thought maybe Grandma needed help with the heavy lifting. She's a caregiver at heart." "A caregiver who forgot her wallet and her car?" I asked. "Uncle, let's be precise. She is still living with Mark. She is still married. If she has so much heart for caregiving, why isn't she at home with the family she actually belongs to?" "You don't understand her," he snapped, his voice rising in a defensive, brittle way. "She's had a hard life. She just wants a family that appreciates her." "Appreciation is earned through consistency, not through stalking an elderly woman at a warehouse club," I said. I didn't wait for his rebuttal. I hung up. I spent the rest of the afternoon looking at the security footage from Grandma's Ring doorbell. I noticed a dark SUV, the same make and model as Sandy's, drive past the house 3 times between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. It didn't stop. It didn't park. It just glided by, a predatory shadow against the suburban pavement. My grandmother was 4'9". She was 78 years old. She was the anchor of our family's history. And Sandy, a woman with a husband in one town and a boyfriend in another, was beginning to circle her like a shark in shallow water. I didn't call the police yet. I didn't scream at my uncle. I simply printed out the map of the 2 Costcos, highlighted the 30-mile discrepancy in yellow ink, and filed it into a physical folder labeled S-Log. The data was growing. The patterns were emerging, and as I watched that dark SUV on the grainy doorbell footage for the fourth time, I realized that the grocery store was just the warm-up. Sandy was looking for something much more valuable than a bulk pack of eggs. She was looking for the vault. 2 weeks later, the pattern shifted from a coincidence to a strategy. My grandmother's pharmacy is a small, quiet place located in a medical plaza 3 miles from her front door. It's the kind of establishment where the pharmacists know her name, her dosage, and exactly how she likes her pill bottles labeled. It is also, by any logical standard, 35 minutes away from Sandy's primary residence. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, waiting for my grandmother to finish picking up her heart medication. The windows were cracked just enough to let in the sterile, dry air of the afternoon. I was reviewing a digital file on my tablet, tracking the increasing frequency of Sandy's random sightings, when I saw a familiar dark SUV pull into the lot. It didn't park in a spot. It idled near the entrance, its engine a low, predatory hum. Then, the driver's side door opened and Sandy stepped out. She wasn't dressed for errands. She was wearing a sharp, vibrant red coat that seemed designed to command attention in a room full of sick people. She walked into the pharmacy with a purposeful stride, her eyes scanning the glass doors before she even reached them. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I simply tapped the record button on my dashboard camera and watched. 10 minutes later, my grandmother emerged, looking smaller and more fragile than usual. Sandy was right behind her, hovering over her shoulder like a dark cloud. I could see the tension in my grandmother's frame, the way her shoulders were hunched, the way her hand gripped her cane. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking rhythmically against the asphalt. Step, 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 a steady, metered pace. "Grandma," I called out, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotional spikes. "I thought you'd be another few minutes." Sandy jumped, a physical, visceral reaction that sent her handbag sliding down her arm. She tried to recover instantly, plastering on that wide, performative smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, Nina, what a lovely surprise to see you here, too." "Is it a surprise, Sandy?" I asked, stopping exactly 4 feet away. "This pharmacy is 35 minutes from your house. It's nearly 40 miles from the office where you claim to work. What brings you to this specific counter on a Tuesday at 2 p.m.? Sandy's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. 2 sharp points of cold light. "My pharmacy was out of my specific thyroid medication," she said, her voice rising in that familiar, defensive lilt. "They told me this was the only branch in the entire county that had it in stock. I'm sure you understand. Health comes first, right?" "That's fascinating," I replied. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen. "Because I'm looking at the inventory app for this chain right now. There are 4 branches within a 5-mile radius of your home that have that medication in stock. In fact, this branch is actually the lowest on stock for that specific drug." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sound of a siren and the mechanical whir of the pharmacy's sliding doors. Sandy's face began to flush, the red of her cheeks matching the red of her coat. She didn't have an answer. In the world of data, there is no room for maybe. There is only the truth and the lie. "You're always so clinical, Nina," Sandy spat, the sweet persona finally beginning to crack. "You're always checking things, verifying things. It's exhausting. Why can't you just be happy that I'm here to check on your grandmother?" "Because you aren't checking on her, Sandy. You're tracking her," I said. My voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a physical blow. Checking on someone involves a phone call. Tracking someone involves a 35-minute drive to a location you have no business being in. My grandmother reached out and touched my arm. Her hand was shaking. "Let's just go, dear," she whispered. I nodded, maintaining eye contact with Sandy until the very last second. As we walked back to the car, I heard Sandy's heels stomping toward her SUV. She slammed the door so hard I could feel the vibration through the soles of my shoes. Once we were inside the car, I didn't start the engine immediately. I looked at my grandmother. "She asked about the bank, didn't she?" Grandma looked down at her lap, her voice barely audible. She asked if this pharmacy was the one that handled the direct deposits for my savings accounts. She said she wanted to make sure the family finances were being handled by a reputable place. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. Sandy wasn't just obsessed with being in the family, she was obsessed with the family's infrastructure. The Costco visit was the scouting report. The pharmacy encounter was the interrogation. She was looking for the keys to a kingdom she hadn't built. I started the car. The engine purred to life, a perfect controlled machine. I looked at the folder on my dashboard. I knew where she was going next. There was only one place left on my grandmother's weekly routine that held any real power. The bank. "Don't worry, Grandma," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "The next time she runs into us, she's going to find out exactly how we handle intruders." There is a specific kind of silence inside a high-end bank. It is the sound of heavy marble, thick glass, and the muffled, rhythmic counting of currency. To my grandmother, this bank was more than a financial institution. It was a sanctuary of her legacy. She had banked here for 42 years. The tellers knew her birthday, and the manager knew the names of every one of her grandchildren. It was a Friday morning, exactly 10:15 a.m. I was standing near the heavy mahogany desk of the branch manager, reviewing the final paperwork for the 3 savings accounts my grandmother was opening. Each account was being seeded with a specific sum, $5,000 each, intended as a foundational trust. I heard the heavy brass doors of the lobby swing open. The sound was distinct, a low, pressurized whoosh followed by the sharp, irregular clicking of heels that didn't belong in a place of business. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Sandy. My internal clock noted the discrepancy. It was mid-morning on a workday, and she had once again driven 35 minutes across county lines to, coincidentally, be in the exact same square footage as my grandmother. "Oh, hello!" Sandy's voice boomed, shattering the professional quiet of the lobby. "I saw your car out front and I just had to come in. I was thinking about opening a high-yield account here myself." My grandmother, standing at the teller window, froze. Her small frame, barely 4'9", seemed to shrink even further as Sandy loomed over her. Sandy didn't look at the tellers. She looked directly at the paperwork on the counter. "What are we doing today?" Sandy asked, her voice dropping into a faux intimate whisper that carried across the room. "Is this for the family fund? My uncle mentioned you were setting things up." "It's private, Sandy," my grandmother said, her voice trembling slightly. Sandy's eyes scanned the documents. She saw the names, she saw the numbers. And then, the mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. Her face reddened, the skin around her eyes tightening into a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "And what about me?" Sandy's voice rose, no longer whispering. "What about my needs? I'm dating your son. We're building a life together. Technically, I'm your daughter-in-law in every way that matters. Why am I not on these documents? Why am I being left out of the family's financial planning?" I stepped forward, my voice a cool, cutting blade. "You aren't on those documents, Sandy, because you aren't family. You are a guest in my uncle's life, and currently a trespasser in my grandmother's bank." "You shut up!" Sandy screamed. She turned back to my grandmother, her finger pointing inches from the elderly woman's face. "You're a selfish old woman! You have all this money and you're giving it to them? I'm the one who's going to be taking care of you. I deserve a seat at this table." The lobby went deathly quiet. I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. 2 tellers stopped mid-count. The branch manager, a man who had known our family since I was in diapers, stood up slowly. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Gable?" the manager asked, his eyes locked on my grandmother. My grandmother looked at Sandy, at the rage, the greed, and the clinical madness in her eyes. Then she looked at the manager. "No," she said softly, "but I would like this woman to leave. Now." The manager didn't hesitate. He caught the eye of the security guard, a large man named Arthur who had guarded this vault for 20 years. Arthur stepped forward, his boots heavy on the marble. "Ma'am," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, "you're disturbing the customers. It's time to go." "Don't you touch me!" Sandy shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. I have a right to be here. My husband is a—" She stopped abruptly, her face turning a pale, sickly white as she realized she had almost mentioned Mark in front of the family she was trying to infiltrate. Arthur didn't wait for her to finish. He placed a firm, professional hand on her elbow. Sandy struggled for a moment, her red coat fluttering like a wounded bird, but the mechanical certainty of the security protocol was too much for her. As she was escorted toward the brass doors, she looked back at us, her mouth twisted into a silent snarl of pure hatred. The doors swung shut with that same pressurized whoosh. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a bridge being burned. My grandmother turned back to the teller, her hands perfectly still as she signed the last document. "Nina," she whispered, "call your aunt. Tell her I'm ready to move. I can't live in a house where the shadows have her face." I looked at the security footage playing on the manager's monitor. I watched Sandy standing on the sidewalk, screaming at the glass doors while cars drove past. She had tried to force her way into the vault, but all she had succeeded in doing was proving that she was a liability we could no longer afford to ignore. "I'll make the call, Grandma," I said. I pulled out my phone and checked the recording from the lobby. The data was complete. The evidence was undeniable. Sandy wasn't just a girlfriend, she was a threat, and the next time we met, it wouldn't be in a lobby. It would be on a screen where the whole world could watch her unravel. The logistics of my grandmother's relocation were handled with the precision of a military extraction. Within 48 hours of the bank incident, I had secured a professional moving crew. The cost was $3,412, a small price to pay for the physical safety of a 78-year-old woman. I watched as they packed her life into 42 cardboard boxes, each one numbered, labeled, and logged into a master inventory on my tablet. Grandma didn't look back as the car pulled out of the driveway. She was moving 3 states away, a distance of exactly 1,104 miles, to live with my aunt. Sandy's reach was long, but it wasn't that long. For the next several months, the silence was absolute. My uncle remained in our home state, living in a house that felt increasingly hollow. He stopped coming over for Sunday dinners. He stopped calling to check in. When we did speak, his voice was thin, filtered through a layer of exhaustion and whatever narrative Sandy was feeding him. I monitored the situation from a distance, checking the public records every 30 days. Sandy was still married to Mark. She was still living in her house. The double life was maintaining its equilibrium, but I knew that equilibrium is a fragile thing. By the time November arrived, the pandemic had shifted our traditional Thanksgiving plans. We decided on a family Zoom call, a digital gathering to bridge the 1,000 miles between us. I was the one who set up the meeting. I generated the encrypted link and distributed it to the family list: my parents, my aunt, my grandmother, and my uncle. I sat in my home office on Thanksgiving morning, the hum of my computer fan the only sound in the room. The table was set for one, but my focus wasn't on the turkey. It was on the participant list. I had my recording software primed. I had the bank security logs from March saved in a folder on my desktop. I felt a strange, cold sense of anticipation. Before I admit the final participants to the call, I have to ask you something. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Type 1 nay if you would have just enjoyed the quiet holiday and kept the peace, or type 2B if you would have been waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing a narcissist never truly goes away. Leave a comment below, and if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what happens in the next 10 minutes of this call changed our family forever. I watched the clock, 2:00 p.m. The digital waiting room began to fill. My grandmother appeared first, her face lighting up as she saw me through her webcam. Then my aunt, then my parents. Finally, my uncle's icon popped up. He looked terrible. His hair was unkempt, and the background of his home office looked cluttered and chaotic. He gave a weak wave, his eyes darting to something off camera. I noticed it immediately, the way he wasn't looking at the lens, but at someone standing just out of sight. For the first 30 minutes, we played the part of a normal family. We talked about the weather, the food, and Grandma's new garden. But I could see the notifications on my secondary monitor. My uncle's phone was vibrating. over and over, a relentless rhythmic buzzing that he tried to ignore until he couldn't. I have to take this, he whispered, his hand reaching for his phone. Uncle, we're in the middle of dinner, I said, my voice as smooth as glass. Is everything all right? It's Sandy, he stammered. She's upset. She's asking why she wasn't invited to the link. She says it's an insult to our union. Our family union is for family, Uncle, I replied. We've discussed this. But the buzzing didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic. And then the join request sound chimed through my speakers. A new participant was trying to enter the meeting. The display name was Sandy and Mark's Home. I looked at the screen. I looked at my grandmother's face, the way the color drained from her cheeks. My hand moved to the mouse. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a surge of anger. I felt the clinical satisfaction of a trap being sprung. Let her in, Nina, my uncle pleaded, his voice breaking. Please, she's hysterical. She's going to make my life a living hell if we don't. I looked at the Admit button. I knew that by clicking it, I was inviting a hurricane into our quiet digital room, but I also knew that Sandy wasn't alone. I had seen the display name. She was joining from the home she shared with her husband. I clicked Admit. The screen flickered, and then Sandy's face filled the frame. She wasn't crying. She was vibrating with a rage so intense it felt like it might melt the plastic of her webcam. And standing right behind her, looking confused and increasingly angry, was a man I recognized from the backyard barbecue photos. It was Mark, her husband. The digital chime of the Admit button felt like the cocking of a literal hammer. The screen flickered, and suddenly the quiet mosaic of our family dinner was shattered. Sandy's face filled the frame, her features distorted by a webcam lens that was too close and a rage that was too raw. Her skin was a blotchy, frantic red, and her hair was disheveled. She didn't offer a greeting. She offered a war cry. "You selfish, arrogant bastards!" she screamed. The audio peaked, a harsh digital crackle that made my grandmother reach for the volume dial on her iPad. "I am family. I have been dating your uncle for months, and you exclude me from Thanksgiving? You think you can just erase me?" I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting flat on the mahogany surface of my desk. My heart rate remained a steady 64 beats per minute. I wasn't looking at Sandy's screaming mouth. I was looking at the man standing behind her. Mark looked exactly like his photos, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a fading hairline. He looked confused, then startled, and then, as Sandy's tirade continued, he looked defensive. He didn't know he was appearing on a family call for his wife's boyfriend's relatives. He only knew his wife was being attacked by people on a screen. "Hey, don't you talk to my wife like that!" Mark roared, leaning into the frame. His voice was a deep, unrefined boom that silenced the other tiles on the Zoom call. "I don't know who you people are, but you have no right to treat her this way. She's been crying for an hour about how you guys treat her at the bank and the pharmacy." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that has a physical weight. On one side of the digital divide, my family sat in stunned paralysis. On the other, Sandy realized her mistake. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking sallow and gray. She had brought her secret weapon, her legal husband, to a fight where his very existence was the ultimate betrayal. "Your wife?" my aunt finally whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Sandy, you're in your kitchen, with your husband, screaming at us for not inviting you to a dinner with your boyfriend?" Sandy's eyes darted between the camera and Mark. She was a cornered animal, her double life collapsing into a singular, messy reality. "It's not like that," she shrieked, turning to Mark. "They're the ones who are crazy, Mark. They're obsessed with me." "Obsessed?" I interrupted, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. I didn't raise my volume. I didn't need to. "Sandy, we have the security logs from the bank. We have the ring footage of your SUV circling Grandma's house. And now, we have you, on camera, with the husband you told my uncle didn't exist." Mark turned to Sandy, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Boyfriend? What is she talking about, Sandy? The screen became a blur of motion. Sandy tried to push Mark out of the frame, but he pushed back. The camera tipped over, showing a chaotic view of their ceiling fan and a half-eaten turkey on their kitchen table. The sound of their shouting, real, visceral marital shouting, filled our speakers. I watched the record icon at the top of my screen. It was glowing red. Every second of this implosion was being captured in high definition. Sandy had wanted to be part of the family record. Now, she was, just not in the way she had planned. The camera on Sandy's end was still tilted, offering a skewed, dizzying view of her kitchen ceiling and a flickering fluorescent light. But the audio was crystal clear. The roar wasn't just a loud noise, it was the sound of a man's world cracking open in real time. "What boyfriend, Sandy? Answer me!" Mark's voice wasn't just angry anymore, it was devastated. I heard the heavy thud of a chair being pushed back, the screech of wood against tile. On my screen, my family sat in a frozen gallery of shock. My uncle's tile was the most haunting. He looked like a man watching his own execution. He didn't speak. He didn't defend her. He just stared at the image of his soulmate being confronted by the husband she had claimed was long gone. "They're lying, Mark. It's a setup." Sandy's voice was a frantic, high-pitched warble. I heard the wet smack of her hand hitting a table. "These people are sick. They've been harassing me since the day I met them. They're trying to ruin us." "Then why is your phone full of messages to a man named Dave?" Mark's voice was closer to the microphone now, low and dangerous. "Why did I find a gift receipt for a watch I never received? And who are these people on the screen, Sandy? Why are they calling you a mistress?" I didn't interject. In clinical psychology, there is a term for this: the collapse of the narcissistic false self. When the two worlds collide, the narcissist doesn't apologize. They incinerate everything around them to hide the truth. "I did it for us!" Sandy suddenly shrieked, her logic leaping into the realm of the absurd. "I was trying to get us into their trust fund. They have millions, Mark. I was doing it for our future." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of my uncle's sharp, ragged intake of breath. He finally spoke, his voice a ghost of its former self. "Sandy, you told me Mark was abusive. You told me he had been gone for 2 years. You told me you loved me." A hand reached out and grabbed the webcam on Sandy's end, jarring it back into place. Mark's face filled the screen. He was breathing hard, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't look at my uncle. He looked at me, perhaps sensing I was the one holding the record button. "I don't know who you people are," Mark said, his voice trembling with a terrifying restraint. "But thank you. You just gave me the evidence I need for the divorce. Sandy, get out. Get out of my house now." The feed cut to black. "The participant has left." The meeting chime rang out twice, once for Sandy and once for my uncle, who had finally disconnected, unable to bear the weight of his own humiliation. I looked at my recording software. The file size was 1.2 gigabytes of pure, unvarnished betrayal. I looked at my grandmother. She was pale, but her eyes were clear. "Is it over, Nina?" she asked softly. "The lie is over, Grandma," I replied, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "Now we just have to deal with the fallout." The silence that followed the disconnection was heavier than the shouting had ever been. On my screen, the remaining tiles showed my parents and my aunt, all of them frozen in a state of digital shock. My grandmother, however, was the only one who moved. I watched her small, weathered hand reach for her camera lens, adjusting it until her eyes, sharp and clear despite her 78 years, were looking directly at the center of the frame. "Is she gone?" Grandma asked. Her voice was low, devoid of the tremors I expected. It was the voice of a judge delivering a final sentence. "The connection is severed, Grandma," I replied. I checked the participant list one last time. My uncle's name was grayed out. Sandy's icon was gone entirely, erased from the digital room as if she had never existed. Grandma nodded once. It was a slow, deliberate movement. "Good. I have spent 40 years building this family's reputation. I have spent 50 years protecting my children. I will not have it dismantled by a woman who doesn't know the difference between a home and a hunting ground." She paused, the only sound in the room being the soft, rhythmic hum of my computer's cooling fan. "Nina, your wedding is in 6 months. I want it made very clear to your uncle. If that woman is within a mile of the ceremony, I will not be there. And if I am not there, the family trust will be frozen until the day I die. No pictures, no invitations, no second chances." It was a clinical execution. Grandma wasn't crying about the betrayal. She was recalculating the inheritance and the guest list. She was cutting out the cancer with the precision of a surgeon. "I'll handle the logistics, Grandma," I said. My voice was as steady as hers. "She won't even find the venue on a map." "See to it," Grandma whispered. She looked at the empty space where Sandy's face had been just moments ago. "This is exactly why nobody liked you, Sandy. You were so busy trying to steal a seat at my table that you forgot the table belongs to me." With a single, decisive click, my grandmother ended the meeting. Her tile vanished, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the black glass of my monitor. The verdict was final. Sandy was no longer a variable. She was a 0. The fallout was as silent as the initial betrayal was loud. I sat in my office 3 days later, the only sound being the rhythmic, mechanical click-clack of my keyboard as I archived the final files. The folder was now 1.4 gigabytes of documented clinical madness. I labeled it Project Sandy Closed and moved it to an encrypted external drive. The numbers told the final story. Within 48 hours, Mark had filed for an emergency divorce. Because of the video evidence I provided, showing Sandy's admission of financial predation and her double life, his lawyer was pushing for a for-cause settlement. Sandy was facing the loss of the house she had spent 35 minutes driving away from every week. My uncle reached out once. His text arrived at 3:14 a.m. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about Mark. I didn't reply with anger. I didn't reply at all. I simply screenshotted the message and added it to the digital ledger. In the world of calm drama, silence is the ultimate weapon. He had chosen to ignore the data for months. He didn't deserve a manual for how to fix the wreckage now. He was currently uninvited from the family Christmas, a decision that saved us exactly $600 in catering and an immeasurable amount of stress. My grandmother is safe now. She is 1,000 miles away, tending to a garden where no dark SUVs drive by. Her blood pressure has stabilized to N20 over 80. The 4'9" woman who was once stalked at a pharmacy is now sleeping through the night. As I closed the final spreadsheet, I looked at the winner's smirk in my own reflection on the dark monitor. I wasn't happy that my uncle's heart was broken, or that a marriage had dissolved. I was satisfied because the boundaries had been restored. The lesson I learned is a simple, clinical truth. A narcissist doesn't want to join your family. They want to consume it. They see your history as a resource and your boundaries as a challenge. They will drive 35 miles out of their way just to stand in your shadow, hoping to steal a piece of your light. But light is governed by the laws of physics. And in this house, we follow the data, we keep the records, and we never, ever invite the hurricane back to the table. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.